Karthus is probably one of the wackiest junglers in the game. Being a foreign mid lane reject and then being smuggled into the jungle, his surprisingly fast clears and incredible scaling make for a playstyle that is both uncanny but also really fun to go for. In this video, I'll be showing you the ins and outs of Karthus and everything you need to know to take advantage of this high tempo jungler. Here's a quick breakdown of how we'll be going over the video. I'll touch on general concepts of Karthus' purpose as a champion and what success looks like in games that you are doing well on him. We'll then discuss different components of his kit and how we can work better to optimize each one of these. This includes going over different jungle matchups, rune optimizations, ability maxing, your build, pathing, how to play out ganks, and how to play out each phase of the game. But if you haven't yet, please subscribe for more content like this, but let's get going. Right off the bat, let's identify Karthus' champion identity, as it pretty much defines his overall playstyle and makes his dynamic in the game super strange. Karthus is in the category of giga farming junglers and is one of the most obnoxious ones in the game. He farms incredibly fast in general, but lacks some of the early game prowess that other junglers in the game benefit from. With that in mind, Karthus needs a ton of resources in order to get going and build his damage within the game. He requires constant handholding and needs his teammates to assist him to make sure he gets strong clears in the early game. He then rewards his teammates handsomely with some incredible scalings and can literally 1v9 games if he's given the appropriate help. He's an extremely gravitating jungler to play, and no matter where you are on the map, you have to think about either helping him out or countering him. With his identity established, let's dig a little bit into the runes. In the current meta, Karthus loves to opt for Dark Harvest as his keystone of choice. His kit is just full of constant DPS abilities that allow him to proc it and reset it incredibly easily. With Dark Harvest as your keystone, you of course have to commit to a domination page as your primary tree. Your choices for this will be Cheap Shot, Eyeball Collection, and either Ravenous or Ultimate Hunter depending on your preference. Most of the runes are best in slot choices except for your Hunter rune, in which case Ravenous Hunter is better if you find that you'll need increased sustain, and Ultimate Hunter if you think you'll have a lot of opportunities to get your ultimate going. I would personally use Ravenous Hunter for more consistency. Moving on to your secondary page, most players will opt for one of two options, either Precision or Inspiration. The Precision page is incredibly helpful because using it allows you to access both coup de grace and presence of mind. Coup de grace synergizes naturally with Requiem, simply increasing its effective damage, and Presence of Mind is surprisingly helpful for not running out of mana in extended fights. Normally, junglers wouldn't need Presence of Mind since they have the increased jungle regeneration from their item, but Karthus just burns through so much mana that he ends up requiring it anyways. The other option is to also opt for the Inspiration tree, which is honestly pretty decent too. It's a value-oriented build that takes Magical Footwear and Cosmic Insight, which just increases your already insane clear speed and saves you that little bit of gold that you can instead commit to your core items. In this regard, I would say that the Precision tree is better, but to each their own. For rune stats, you should take double Adaptive Force and follow up with your resistance of choice depending on the matchup. In this case, I'd probably take armor most of the time as it helps against most jungle camps. Moving on to build, Karthus can get pretty interesting with his choices depending on what he wants to go for. Starting with his mythic options, he's got a couple of choices he can opt for depending on your playstyle. Most of the time, your best shot's going to be with Liandry's Anguish. Karthus has a lot of consistent magic damage in his kit, and it allows you to take full advantage of the burn damage that Liandry's gives you access to. I honestly think Ludens is not a terrible choice for Karthus either, also being a strong lost chapter item with a great mythic passive. The problem is that the frequency at which Ludens provides that additional burst is so infrequent that it tends to be a pretty low impact passive when compared to the Liandry's. By this point, you'd want to pick up your boots of choice as well, which for Karthus should always be Sorcerer's Shoes, except in the most obscene circumstances. Karthus needs to deal damage in order to be a useful champion because there is literally nothing else that he brings to the table. The flat 18 magic penetration does absolute wonders for his damage in the early game and sets a great baseline for later stages in the game as well. If you have a really strong early game or want to have a higher impact item to start off with, I also think picking up a Dark Seal on your first or second base is also a good high value choice. After that, your build follows a pretty simple principle of just slamming as much damage onto yourself as possible in order to maximize your effectiveness, and for the most part, this is a really rewarding way to build up your damage further. There are many common, decent options to go for in this regard. Zhonya's is an awesome choice for Karthus because although he's very squishy, being able to pseudo frontline with it allows him to greatly increase his effectiveness in teamfights while minimizing his potential risk. Another common pickup is Void Staff, and there's a good distinction to be made for why Void Staff is actually a more common pickup than Rabadon's in a lot of cases for Karthus. There's absolutely nothing wrong with having Rabadon's either, as Karthus can still get a huge spike in his damage from picking it up, but its high price tag does make it a little less approachable than Void Staff, which can be picked up for much cheaper. Karthus' scalings on his abilities aren't actually that high when compared to the raw amount of base damage he can put right now, so it's actually more gold effective to pick up Void Staff for this reason. Instead of picking up just as much AP as he can possibly muster, Karthus enjoys all of the accessory items that allow him to increase his damage in other ways, and Void Staff allows him to do that incredibly well. There's also some tech items you can pick up in certain situations as you need it, like Morello for the access to heal cuts, or Banshees if you need to block off very specific abilities from the enemy. If you picked up Liandry's as your mythic, Demonic Embrace is a classic hand-in-hand item to go along with it as well, as both of their burn mechanics in unison create for a pretty devastating combo. Karthus has a lot of options within the AP mage class, and the order in which you pick your items to add to your arsenal can greatly affect how you can play him and what you can do on him. The scariest thing about playing Karthus jungle for sure is the potential for a huge amount of variance depending on your matchup. Most people know about how hard your champion scales, so everyone in their right mind will want to kill you. If you're playing against champions that have strong early games like Xin Zhao or Jarvan, you better be extremely careful in your early clears. It is very easy to give up kills on your first or second clear if you get invaded, so make sure to communicate that to your teammates and get potential help whenever you can. There's a big trough to cross here in the first 8 or so minutes, and you have to do as much as you can to ensure that you can stabilize and constantly rotate your camps. Against tanks, your job's a little bit easier as you don't have to worry as much about the potential for invades. Likewise with other scaling AP junglers like Evelynn or Echo, although they gain a lot of potency with a little bit of time, there's a bit of a handshake that goes off in these situations that basically says that both champions are allowed to scale and both champions will have high impact in the game and cause some chaos. Depending on the nature of the matchup and how much agency Karthus will have against it in the early game, you have to constantly be ready to adjust your game plan to match it. Which leads well into pathing and clearing. Karthus is very well defined by thriving off of insanely high tempo clears and reaches only for the highest probability plays that allow him to propel himself ahead. In simple terms then, that makes his condition for his early path simple. Clear all 6 of your camps in the safest way possible. Karthus jungle also has some relatively complicated micro for his jungle clear compared to other champions. There's a lot of constant weaving between your Qs and your auto attacks, and you have to consistently be able to kite camps together and clear multiple camps at once as well. Before we even think about pathing in certain directions, we have to master this concept as well, and it's fairly important to grasp. Now, let's talk about how your path can change from game to game. Generally speaking, I'd say Karthus' condition for him to be happy in the early game will be relatively constant. The more time you have to just relax and farm in the game, the better. What may make the direction of his clears more creative is considering the high potential for the enemy to invade and clearing for his own safety. Sometimes you'll just be in an unwinnable matchup, and we as the Karthus players have to accept that there's only so much we can do about that. So, the way we adapt to this is to clear literally to maximize our safety while getting our own camps when we can. Attempting to predict where the enemy jungle will clear and adapting our clear to avoid that is a great way to stabilize the early game. Another way to do it is to shield yourself by pathing towards your winning lanes so that when you come into the situation where you need to call on your laners for help, you can rely on them to do so since they'll be in a winning matchup and able to move to it. Sometimes Karthus will be unable to fight the first crab, and it is actually okay to allow this to happen. If the enemy jungler is on the crab first and the fight seems difficult, just go to the other crab if you can help it. If even that is rough to handle, even giving both crabs on Karthus jungle is not too out of the ordinary. It's definitely not ideal, but playing Karthus is a rough life in the early game, and we have to embrace that struggle a little bit. Karthus has a couple of minor micro tips to use during his fights. The first one is going to be used fairly often and it mainly applies in the early game, but he benefits greatly from weaving auto attacks in between each of his Qs. A lot of the time, he'll also have red buff in these situations, and the minor slow that it provides is actually super helpful in being able to chain a few Qs consecutively. This is a relatively simple combo to explain, but the execution of it is actually really difficult because you have to balance auto spacing, weaving abilities, and making sure you're hitting a skill shot every single second, which is a lot to handle. A soft combo that Karthus has with his Q as well is actually hitting QW. By starting with a Q and then using W right after, it locks the slow right at the time to hit the Q while minimizing the amount of time the enemy has to react. This greatly increases the probability of your first Q hitting and forces the enemy to think on the back foot now while you constantly barrage them with further Qs. These combos, while mild, can be directly applied to Karthus in his gank situations as well. Since Karthus has no real gap closing ability, the best thing you can do for a gank is start behind the opponent and simply hit as many of your Qs as you possibly can while keeping up the chase. You can use your W basically at any point in order to hit your Q more effectively, and make sure to apply auto attack weaving in the early game just to maximize your damage output. Of course, the fun part about Karthus ganks is although you can gank normally, you can also do the work from home gank and just press R on them instead. Good stuff. Lastly, let's talk team fights. Karthus has a unique role in fights because his passive enables this really strange level of persistence and damage, so even if he gets caught out, he can still be pretty useful. With that being said, you'd still definitely want to live as long as possible and avoid dying altogether if you can help it. But if you can't do that, that's still fine. Play fights front to back and play to keep dealing as much damage as possible before you get converged on. You're considered an important backline target in the fights, so take advantage of that and be as annoying as possible. You can also hold your ultimate until after you die or until the fight ends, and you can essentially get a kill confirm onto an enemy. If you do get a decent angle on the enemy team, or if you get engaged on, Zhonya's or Stopwatch is a great item to have in these situations, as it allows you to buy time and deal more damage at the same time. Your E does not get interrupted while in Zhonya's, so it's another way to get more value out of each second you have in a fight. So that's pretty much Karthus in a nutshell actually. He's got an incredibly weird dynamic and philosophy in the jungle, but it's definitely a playstyle you can get around. I'd recommend trying it out in solo queue as its potency is actually really decent, especially if you can get around the harsh learning curve that it has. Hope this guide helps you guys out, and I will see you in the next one. Stay fresh.